Hi Art Nerds! Today I'm going to show you how to create this beautiful pansy illustration using various mixed media. Today we're going to be using Canson's Plein Air Watercolor Artboard, and to ink we're going to start with a couple of sepia Faber-Castell Pitt pens, a brush pen, and a small pen for the smaller details. So the Faber-Castell Pitt pens are India ink based pens, and if you allow them to dry fully, they are waterproof. So give them about 24 hours to dry and you should be able to do almost any media save for alcohol marker on top of them. So what I'm going to do is I am going to start by inking the finer details using the, fine, not small, Pitt pen. So this is a fixed width or technical width pen, and it's only going to produce one line weight, so it's perfect for handling smaller details if you maybe struggle to create smaller details utilizing the brush. And here we have the brush pen, and the cool thing about the Faber-Castell brush pen, I know a lot of people complain that the tip starts to fray really early. The thing about this is you can actually remove that brush, flip it over, reinsert it, and you have a whole new brush. So you can get twice the life out of your Pitt pens than you originally thought you could. And they're available in a wide range of colors, so they're perfect if you enjoy doing colored line arts and you're looking for just the right color. They're also part of the Faber-Castell numerical system. That means that Pitt pens are going to match the polychromos, they're going to match the Albrecht Durer watercolor pencils, and they're going to match the new Albrecht Durer watercolor markers. You just need to make sure you match the color number. This makes color matching much easier. And we are inking on the Canson Plein Air Watercolor Artboard. This is a cellulose-based Montval covered artboard. So if you guys aren't familiar with Montval watercolor paper, it is one of their cellulose-based watercolor papers that has some tooth but not a whole lot of tooth to it. I paint my Cara pages on Montval, so I'm very familiar with it and I know how to handle it. And I will say that it is a perfect match for the mixed media we're using today, including these Pitt pens. Since it doesn't have too much texture, it's easy to ink on. So you guys can see I used a brush, or I switched over to a brush for some of these larger details. So now we're inking the pansies, and using the brush allows me to be not only faster, but more fluid, more organic with how I'm inking. So I have loads of brush nib and brush pen inking tutorials here on this channel. I'm not going to walk you guys through it today. I do also have a tutorial where I printed out the blue lines that you guys can oh so faintly see. And I'm going to link that in the description below if you're curious as to how to get Canson's heavier papers and their artboards to run through your printer. So once my illustration has had a chance to dry, and I give it about 24 hours to allow the pigments to kind of bond to the paper, I find that this really helps prevent smearing, smudging, and ghosting when I'm working. And I know for so many of us, it's really hard to wait 24 hours. So what I do is I actually pop this up on my drawing rack and I start working on another project. I usually have 3 or 4 projects going at any given time, which allows my ADHD self to be able to code switch to project switch and to continue to utilize my hyper focus and my motivation when I actually have them available. Now I realize this isn't feasible for all artists, but I hear a lot of artists complain to me personally that they can't wait for 24 hours. Well, folks, that's how I wait for 24 hours. Anyway, we've finished inking this. I'm going to pop it on the drying rack and let it dry for 24 hours before we begin our watercolor. So it's been a little bit over 24 hours. It's actually been about half a week, and I am going to apply a generous wash of water to this. This is going to reactivate those blue lines. It's going to cause them to lift up and let me absorb them with a paper towel. So if you guys were wondering how I got rid of those, now you know. Today we're going to be working with the Faber-Castell Albrecht Durer Watercolor pencils and the brand new Albrecht Durer Watercolor markers. These are pigment-based watercolor markers that are available in a wide range of colors. They're available in 30 different colors and have 2 tips, a brush tip and a bullet tip. And you guys can check those out on my Faber-Castell unboxing video that I'll link in the description below. I talk about them in a little bit more depth. I'm also using the Faber-Castell Albrecht Durer Watercolor pencils. There are 120 colors available in this lineup of watercolor pencils, and they correspond with the 30 colors in the Albrecht Durer watercolor marker line. So I am applying a background wash of ultramarine blue. So what I did first, since I wanted a really light wash, is I applied it to a non-porous craft surface. Now years ago when I did more watercolor marker tutorials, someone pointed out to me that this is not actually using watercolor markers. I do care to disagree. You are free to use art supplies in the way that best suits you, and I love presenting a variety of techniques so you guys can find techniques and tips that work for the way you create art. Now, I'm not a huge saturated color fan. I like to build up my colors, and I gotta tell you guys, the markers deliver a lot of color. So it's great to know a few different tricks to help you kind of manage your color dispersal. So that's why I applied it to my non-porous craft sheet, and these things are super duper handy. I use them all the time when I'm painting, and I'll link those in the description as well as the products themselves. So a little bit more about the Albrecht Durer watercolor markers. These were sent to me by Faber-Castell to help me prepare for Hands-On Creativity, which is a 2-day art supply event in Nashville, Tennessee, and it is hosted by Plaza Artist Materials. Now, if you have a Plaza Artist Materials in your area, you might have a Hands-On Creativity of your own, and if you do, I highly recommend you go. As I mentioned, it is free. There are art supply reps from all over the country, from Daniel Smith to Faber-Castell to Strathmore to even Copic. So if you're looking to learn more about the supplies you use, it's a great chance to ask some questions in person and actually get to talk to someone who knows what they're talking about. There's been so many times when I've contacted a company, aka looking at you, Winsor Newton, only to be told by the rep that they don't know and that it's my job to find out when I'm literally asking what the solvent is in the pigment markers. So being able to ask someone in person who knows what they're talking about so you can get actual product answers is huge for me. There's also free workshops, which are phenomenal. I've taken the Daniel Smith watercolor workshop twice and the Winsor & Newton watercolor workshop 3 times, as well as free samples. So if you're like me and you love to get your hands on new and upcoming art supplies, this is a great event for art nerds. And that's where I'm going to be this upcoming weekend. This video will have come out way in the future after this event, but I'm going to be at Hands-On Creativity this weekend, October 26th and 27th, working with Faber-Castell and Strathmore. So that's part of the inspiration behind this image and behind this video. Alright, so after I've applied a second wash of ultramarine, mixed slightly darker to the background, to the tops of her eyes, and to the shadows on her white pinafore, I am using, I want to say, red ochre to color this little girl's skin. So Faber-Castell does make a variety of flesh tints. I'm not really a big fan of them. I think they're a little too opaque. They feel a little bit muddy. When I did my tests, they just weren't the color I was looking for. But this color, which I have to check, burnt ochre, is a much better fit. So what I did is I applied it dry to the paper first, and then I reactivated it using a little bit of water. And I basically only applied it to the areas that are shadow. And since I wanted to build up multiple layers of this color to build up color depth, I activated the whole area with water and then allowed it to dry fully. And that's the big tricky thing with using watercolor pencils, is for best results you want the paper to dry fully before your next application if you're like me and you like to do lots of layers and lots of glazes. That's going to give you a fresh tooth to the surface, so the paper is going to have a little bit more tooth and the pencil will stick to it a little bit better. Alright, so now I am applying a very light, cool yellow using one of the really cool Albrecht Durer Magnus watercolor pencils. Honestly, guys, I like the Magnus pencils better than the regular pencils. They're easier on my hands. They have better pigment delivery. They're just better in my opinion, and I would like to get more of the Magnuses. Now, to be fair, I do have early onset arthritis in my hands, so this has become a topic that I talk about a lot, is how comfortable are art supplies to hold and use for long periods of time. Now, spoiler alert, as you get older, you're not going to necessarily love creating art any less. You're not going to be any less passionate. In fact, often as you get older, you have the money and the free time to pursue art. So I think it's really important to kind of cater to and acknowledge these older artists, or these artists who might also have disabilities, by talking about functionality and comfort levels. So on top of the Magnus, I'm applying kind of a mid-green, spring green color. And if I can get rid of the cat on my lap, I can kind of tell you guys what colors I'm using. Now, generally, when I do these kind of tutorials, I don't like telling you guys exactly what colors I'm using, and it's not out of laziness. It's because I want to encourage you guys to discover your own mixes. I don't want you to just copy mine. But for the sake of this tutorial, I am using Emerald Green, number 163. And if you look closely at your Albrecht Durer, any Albrecht Durer product, you will notice that it has a star rating, and that star rating is an indicator of light fastness, with 3 stars being the most light fast. And don't worry, guys, I'm going to pop loads of information down in the description below. So if you're missing something, fear not. The color I used before in Magnus was light yellow glaze 104. So if you're familiar with watercolors, you may notice that Faber-Castell doesn't use quite the same names or even quite the same colors that we might be familiar with. The ultramarine blue that I applied earlier, when you apply it at full strength, it's actually kind of cool for an ultramarine blue. So I really highly recommend that you swatch your colors so that you're familiar with them. Maybe even do some tests. So the color I just applied was dark phthalo green 264. And now I'm applying a wash of clean water just to kind of blend these colors and to get them activated, and so that I can apply future colors, future layers on top of it. So while that dries, I'm going into her skin with a little bit of Pompeian red, which I promise is not as harsh as it looks. I'm applying it to the cheeks, the underside of the nose, the tops of the eyelids, beneath her neck, on her little knuckles, on her little elbow. And if this illustration looks familiar to you, it was my Inktober 2019 Day 1 illustration. One of the great things about doing Inktober is I create 31 illustrations that I can use throughout the year for field tests like this one, or just to fully render because I feel like creating a new illustration. So for the butterfly, I'm using a little bit of cadmium yellow 107, as well as our burnt ochre number 187. And now we switch over to the markers. And for these markers, my vast preference is for the brush tip. So the brush tip seems pretty similar to the brush tip on the big Pitt Pens. It's not like a super flexible brush, but even though I used it in like 3 different tutorials, I didn't find that it was particularly prone to fraying. It's not necessarily my favoriteest of my brush tips, but it's also not my least favorite, and I like it better than the Winsor & Newton pigment watercolor markers brush tip. Now, same problem applies to these markers as applied to the Winsor & Newtons, where the bullet tip gets less of the pigment than the brush tip. I would really love to see a company create a watercolor marker that has a pump action in the bullet nib so we can get more pigment flowing. I'd also like to see refillable pigment brush pens. Now, you can refill Ecoline brush pens, but those are dye-based, and the Molotow soft liner line is pump activated. You can pump more fluid in, but that's also dye-based. I think this is a technical innovation that could be really useful for pigment-based markers like this one, because sometimes they start to run dry, or sometimes the color is not quite what you're looking for. So that's definitely something I would love to see a company investigate. And there are pigment inks on the market. I say pigment inks, pigment watercolors, liquid watercolors on the market, like Hydrus watercolors. So the technology is like sort of there. Something else I would like to see that I don't think is probably feasible, just given the limitations of pigment technology, is I'd love to see a good white watercolor brush pen from Faber-Castell. That would just about make my day. And for all I know, I'll roll into hands-on creativity this weekend and there will be a white pigment brush pen in front of my eyes and I will buy it. And part of the reason I want a white watercolor brush pen is so that I can add highlights, I can add details, and then I can wash them away. So in the Pitt Pen line, there is a large white Pitt Pen that I actually really like. It's very opaque, but it's a large bullet tip, which makes it a little harder for me to use. So as I apply our dark green, and it is dark phthalo green number 264, I'm washing it out with a little bit of water so we can disperse some of that color. As you guys can see, the pigment markers deliver a very saturated punch of color. I would say this is like full tinted strength for watercolor, and that's why I liked applying it, or I enjoy applying it also to my craft mat and then blending it out. So I'm going to continue this application with the dark phthalo green on all of the leaves. So those of you who know me know that as I do watercolor, I move around, I go back and forth, I add details here, I add details here. So I'm using a magenta now. I can double check that color for y'all. I'm using magenta 133 to add some skin tone shadows, and I like using warmer purples to add shadows to skin tones because you designate the shadow but you don't cool it down too much. And again, I kind of wash it out, brush it out a little bit with water, just so that it's not so striking. So at this point, I'm using a cover sheet to kind of protect my paper from my hand, to protect it from smearing. And I'm applying in the Magnus a little bit of the yellow glaze, and then a little bit of the phthalo blue. So that's 110. And one of my other complaints about the 24 color set is, y'all, I want a dark, cool blue. We have a dark, warm blue with reddish, helio blue reddish, 151. I want the same thing in a dark, cool blue. As someone who paints a lot of foliage and a lot of flowers, that is super duper useful to me. We do get a darker green in dark phthalo green, number 264, but I want even darker, y'all. And I want a good medium dark purple, like a dioxine purple. Heliotrope reddish blue is really kind of a purple, but I want like a wabam purple. Maybe that's just like how I'm used to handling color. And one of the cool things about any of the Albrecht Durer colors, any of the Albrecht Durer products, is you can buy them open stock. So if a set doesn't have something you need, you can order it online. You can create your own custom set to suit your needs. So I'm just kind of going over our leaves. I'm adding more yellow and more blue, just kind of trying to develop that color. And also I found that the wash of dark phthalo green was just a little bit intense. And since it was so intense, it made it a little dull, a little uninteresting. So I'm kind of trying to break that up by adding additional color. So now I'm going into her hair, and I wanted to give her really dark hair, so I'm using walnut brown, which is not in my set. Where did it go? I'm gonna have to track it down, but I'm using walnut brown for her hair, so unfortunately I cannot give you the color number because I have misplaced my pencil. And I am just kind of blending it out. So I'm leaving some of the white of the paper to give the implication of highlights. And by building up this color, it's going to create shinier hair. I'm also coloring her eyes with a couple of different blues. I started with light ultramarine, 160, and then I went in with cobalt blue, 143. I'm also extending the background ultramarine blue, so that's that marker. I am extending it beneath the leaves. Now it dries almost invisible, but it's just enough to make it look like this is actually sitting on the paper. Now I'm adding a little bit of black and warm gray to the tips of the butterfly wings and blending it out just a little bit. So now we're going to start really working on those pansies. And the 10 color Albrecht Durer marker set does not come with a cool yellow. So I'm starting with dark chrome yellow, number 109. And I'm applying it directly to the paper, and then I'm blending it out using water. And this has a load of pigment strength. You're going to get a lot of color with these. A little bit goes a really long way. I have the light beige pink, which is sort of what I would consider the Caucasian skin tone of the set. It's coming to me in the mail. I'm really looking forward to seeing how that handles and how I'm able to color skin tones with just the markers. So I'm going to apply this dark chrome yellow, number 109, 3 light fast stars. I'm going to apply that to the majority of the pansy leaves and blend that out using water. So the 10 color set also doesn't have a purple, so I'm going to make my own. And I'm starting with Ultramarine number 120. And you guys can, oh, actually, that is not true. What I actually did is I grabbed Phthalo Blue 110 by accident and put it down. And then I was like, I kind of like this. It's kind of working for me. So I did a couple with the Phthalo Blue number 110. Definitely a happy accident. Usually I just have accidents. And then I'm going to switch over to Ultramarine number 120 because I want to make my own purple. And when I was a little girl, pansies were my favorite flower. I grew up in Louisiana, which is a little too hot for pansies. It tends to kill them off. But I thought they were beautiful. As an adult, my favorite flowers are violets and fruit-bearing tree flowers. So like apple, quince, and peaches, cherry blossoms, and plums. And pansies are actually edible. They're one of the most beautiful edible flowers and are often used to decorate pastries and cakes and to create candies. Talk about eating with your eyes, huh? So I'm applying Ultramarine first, and then I'm going to apply a layer of magenta on top of it to create our purple. I lied to you. Actually, I'm starting with the magenta first, and it's actually called Middle Purple Pink, but it looks like a magenta to me, and it's number 125 with 3 light fast stars. So, if you know your color theory, a warm red or pink plus a warm blue makes for a pretty decent purple. Not the best purple. I prefer my purple straight from the can, straight from the tube, but it's a pretty good purple. So what I do is I apply it straight from the marker to the center of the petals, and then I blend out using a little bit of water. And this gives us a little bit of color graduation. So next I apply some more walnut to her hair, and her hair has had plenty of time to dry, which gives us a fresh surface to apply on. Now I'm doing another really fun watercolor watercolor pencil technique where you utilize your brush to just pull some pigment directly from the pencil and then apply it to the paper. And this is going to give you a much more saturated application. So while that dries, I'm going to continue refining my pansies, and I'm using a little bit of the phthalo blue in the centers because if you look at pansies, you'll notice that many of them have kind of a darker heart of color on the inside of each petal, and that's something I wanted to capture here. Now we're going to use a little bit of color theory to make some purple. I'm applying some ultramarine directly on top of our middle purple pink, number 125, and blending it out with water. And something that I'm enjoying about this is it does activate the pink just a little bit, but it doesn't like completely reactivate it, so it doesn't look like just mud. So you get some of that optical blending going on where you have the pink underneath and you can see the vibrancy of the pink, but you have that overlay, that glaze of the blue. And that's something I often miss when I'm working with dye-based watercolor markers, is it tends to just reactivate the whole dang thing. So I have to handle dye-based watercolor markers differently than pigment-based watercolor markers. So I was really excited when Faber-Castell announced the Durer watercolor markers, but I kind of sat on it for a minute because times are tough, budgets are tight, and I just didn't have the money to buy them. Art nerd problems, am I right, y'all? So I am so super grateful and so stoked that Faber-Castell sent me some to help me prep for hands-on creativity. It was really awesome to get to mess around with these, to create some art with these, and to be able to become familiar with them, and I really appreciate them sending me a set. Hopefully this tutorial will inspire you guys to try some mixed media techniques using watercolor pencils or watercolor markers. It's really fun to think outside the pan and think outside the tube, and it's kind of freeing to be able to use watercolor in a whole different format. So you guys know I will try to watercolor with anything water-based, and some markers work better than others. These work way better than some of the others I've tried. A bad watercolor marker, you might as well just buy like a Crayola Super Tip and watercolor with that, because you can watercolor with Crayola Super Tips. But these are really nice. I love the pigment load. I like the colors, and I've already bought a bunch more of these markers because I just couldn't help myself. Once I knew I liked these, I couldn't help myself. So now I'm painting in just a little bit of ultramarine into the yellow of her little bonnet, and that's just to kind of start establishing the shadows. So I have some of the middle purple pink mixed up. I'm going to paint her dress with that. So originally I was going to kind of go for very light purple, like a lavender with the ultramarine and the pink, but I decided to leave it just pink since we have a lot of purple going on in here, and pink is just kind of part of this color palette even if you can't see it super well. So I wanted to bring that out just a little bit more. So I applied the middle purple pink directly to my craft mat, mixed a bunch of water in, and that allows me to do a much lighter controlled application. Once the pansies dried, I'm going into the center and adding a little bit more ultramarine blue just to kind of tighten the details, and then blending it out with just a smidge of water to soften the brush marks so that it doesn't feel so much like it was applied with a marker, but it feels more like it was watercolored or even naturally occurring. with some of my ultramarine blue, I'm going in and darkening the shadows on her dress. So one of my disappointments is with this blue, when you water it down, it's really hard to saturate it enough. So I feel like we're either working with full saturation from the marker or a very desaturated version. But I look forward to seeing what some of the other colors in the Albrecht Durer range have to offer. And I could have switched over to the Albrecht Durer Watercolor pencil. So I'm applying another layer of yellow glaze to her bonnet. And I'm adding some more of our dark chrome yellow to the center of our pansy. So you guys can see these markers actually layer really well. And I didn't really have any problems with the paper tearing up, which is a problem I've had with direct application using watercolor markers in the past. And it's one of the reasons I've hesitated from doing direct marker application in the past. Sorry, that became a tongue twister and my mouth was like boo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. So now I'm going to color the stems of the pansies using the bullet nibs for May Green, which is number 170, and dark phthalo green, which is number 264. And I'm actually using the bullet tips to do a little bit of blending. So these markers are juicy enough that you can do color into color blending with them, but I wouldn't recommend using the bullet tips for that because they're a little bit stiff and they can abrade the paper surface. So that's just something you kind of want to be wary of when you're using these. They recommend you save the bullet tips for fine details, and I'm talking, y'all, like really fine, like finishing touches details. Use the brush tips for, you know, your layered applications like this one. And going back in with ultramarine and adding just a, oh no, wait, I'm sorry. That is phthalo blue, and I'm adding some more detail to our leaves, and then I went in with ultramarine and added a little bit more detail to our flowers. On camera, the two blues in terms of the caps look really similar, so I apologize. So now I'm doing a direct application using our middle purple pink. So I'm really bringing that pop of color, and then I'm going to blend it out just to soften it a little bit using some water. So in a lot of my videos, I talk about how we don't start with our darkest color. We want to build up to that because it creates volume, it creates lighting. That's definitely something to keep in mind with these markers, is they're starting with their darkest value. So you might want to apply it indirectly to a non-porous surface like a piece of scrap plastic, or, as I keep saying, a non-porous craft sheet, or a piece of glass, like you could buy a cheap picture frame or even a cheap ceramic plate from Dollar Tree and apply your marker to that and use that as a palette. And then you can build your color up. Because as you guys can see, these colors come, or these markers come out of the gate like, bam, they're ready to go, they're ready to run. So now I'm adding just a little bit of shadow using Helio Blue Reddish number 151 with Albrecht Durer, and kind of going back and forth with the markers, adding more shadow, adding more detail. So again, with these markers, once you've put down a layer, it's pretty much saturated the area. It's not like alcohol markers where you can get kind of 3 layers of tone. These are immediate. It's like Posca markers where if you cover the area, even if you put another layer of the same color down, you're not really going to see like a color shift. You're just going to get more opacity. So if you're going to do a direct application, it's better if you shade with a darker marker or if you shade with a pencil, as in the case of Helio Reddish Blue here. Or I'm sorry, just Helio Blue Reddish. So now I'm going in with a little bit of light yellow glaze because pansies have kind of those little yellow hearts at the center. So I want to make sure I try and indicate that. And I'm adding a little bitty bit of the ultramarine directly to the darkest part and the most shaded parts of the bows. So at this point, I'm just going to be using Helio Blue Reddish to add my shading and shadows, and I'm not going to wash that out. I'm letting the grain of the paper create kind of a dry brush, softer effect, and I'm just going to leave it as is. And going back in with our light yellow glaze just to add some highlights to our leaves and add some liveliness. And finally, I'm trying to add some white highlights using their just white 101. I don't find the Faber-Castell white to be as opaque as I would like. So now would be a great time for a small opaque white Pitt pen. And I'm going in with the Van Dyke Brown, Dark Sepia 175. I find that Dark Sepia, when you wash it out, looks like a Van Dyke Brown. It's a very warm dark brown rather than kind of a cool dark brown. I went into her hair and just kind of directly applied Dark Sepia on top of the color pencil. All right, guys, that about wraps it up. Thank you guys so much for watching this tutorial. I hope it was helpful, useful, and informative. Make sure you check the description below for more information about these products as well as links to where you can get your own. Hopefully, I will see you guys again real soon. Have a great day, guys.